Hello there, dear. Come in, come in. Don't just stand there in the doorway. It's a bit of a dreary day out, isn't it? The rain is making a soft little drumming sound on the window panes. I've always found that sound rather comforting. It's a good day for a cup of tea and a story, don't you think? Let me just pour you a cup. There now. Is that enough milk? You know, I was just sitting here a moment ago, stirring my tea just the one sugar for me these days. My doctor would have my hide otherwise, and I caught a glimpse of myself in the back of the spoon. It's funny, the things you see, not just the wrinkles. Oh dear, there are plenty of those, a whole road map of my life right there on my face. But I saw my hands, these old, gnarled hands. They've held so much. They've held babies, and fevers, and letters from far away. They've kneaded dough and planted gardens. But it's the things they had to let go of, I think, that truly shaped them. That's when I remembered. It all came flooding back, triggered by the simplest thing. It's this little thing, here on the mantelpiece. You see it, the porcelain music box. It's not much to look at now, I suppose. The paint is faded, and if you look closely, you can see a web of tiny, spidery cracks all over it. I glued it back together myself, a long, long time ago. It doesn't play its tune anymore, but I can still hear it in my heart. The song was Clair de Lune, Moonlight, and it was the theme song to a part of my life that feels like a dream now. This box, it takes me back to 1958. I was 17, and I was in love. Oh, not that silly puppy love you see in the pictures. This was the real thing, the kind of love that makes you feel like you could fly, but also terrifies you to your very bones. His name was Arthur. He didn't come from a family with money or a grand name. His father was a carpenter, and Arthur was a dreamer. He had hands that were always smudged with charcoal or paint, and a smile that could coax the sun from behind the clouds. He saw the world not just for what it was, but for what it could be. He saw that in me too. He didn't see just Lily, the quiet daughter of the town's most respected and most feared shopkeeper. He saw me. My father was a good man. You understand, but he was a hard man. The Great Depression had carved deep lines of worry into his soul, and the war had solidified them. He believed in security, in practicality, in sensible matches. He saw Arthur as a frivolous distraction, a penniless artist who would lead me to ruin. Love doesn't put food on the table, Lily, he'd say, his voice low and rumbling like distant thunder. My mother, bless her heart, was a gentle soul, a dove married to a hawk. She understood my feelings, I think, but she was a product of her time. She would just squeeze my hand and say, "Be careful, my love. Your father only wants what's best for you." But what I thought was best for me was spending stolen moments with Arthur down by the creek, hidden by the weeping willows. The air would smell of damp earth and wildflowers. He would read me poetry, and I would listen to him talk about moving to the city, of having a studio where he could paint all day. He made me feel like a part of a beautiful, secret world. For my 17th birthday, he gave me the music box. He'd saved 4 months to buy it. It was perfect and pristine, a little porcelain ballerina in the middle, frozen in a graceful pose. He presented it to me in a small, velvet-lined box. "So you never forget our dance," he whispered, his eyes shining with a sincerity that made my heart ache. I kept it hidden in my wardrobe, beneath my winter sweaters. Every night, after my parents were asleep, I'd take it out. I'd wind the tiny key and open the lid, and the delicate notes of Clair de Lune would fill the silence of my room. The little ballerina would twirl, and in her, I saw all my hopes and dreams dancing. It was my most precious secret, a symbol of a future my father would never approve of, a future I wanted more than anything. I remember one night so clearly. The house was still, the only sound the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. I was holding the box, the music playing its soft, tinny melody. I felt a surge of hope so strong it was almost painful. And then I heard it. The sound that always made my blood run cold. The slow, heavy tread of my father's footsteps coming down the hall, stopping right outside my door. My heart hammered against my ribs. I snapped the lid shut, the music cutting off abruptly, and shoved the box back into its hiding place, praying he hadn't heard. The doorknob began to turn, the door creaked open, and the light from the hallway spilled across my floorboards, a harsh, interrogating stripe of yellow. I was sitting on my bed, my hands clasped in my lap, trying to make my breathing even. My father stood there, a large, imposing silhouette. He didn't need to raise his voice to be intimidating. His very presence filled a room, sucking the air out of it. "Lily," he said, his voice flat. "It's late. You should be asleep." "I was just thinking, Papa," I managed to say, my own voice a reedy whisper. He looked around the room, his eyes sharp and suspicious. Back in those days, a father's word was law, and my father ruled his house like a king. He believed in order, discipline, and the absolute avoidance of what he called emotional nonsense. He was a man who had survived hardship by burying his feelings so deep they might as well have been in another country. His gaze lingered for a moment on my wardrobe, and my heart leaped into my throat. But then he just grunted, a sound of mild disapproval, and pulled the door close, plunging me back into darkness. I didn't breathe again until I heard his footsteps, retreating down the hall. I waited a full 10 minutes, my body rigid, before I allowed myself to relax. The close call made me more careful, but also more desperate. The secret I was keeping felt like a living thing, a bird trapped in my chest, beating its wings against my ribs. Arthur and I continued to meet, but the shadow of my father loomed over us. A few weeks later, the tension in our house grew thick, enough to choke on. My father had started talking about the Hendersons. Mr. Henderson owned the largest hardware store in the next town over. He had a son, Walter. Walter was a good man, I suppose, reliable, steady. He was taking over the family business. He was everything my father admired. He was polite and respectful, but when he looked at me, his eyes were placid, like a cow's. There was no spark, no life. He saw a good wife, a sensible match. He didn't see me any more than my father did. The Hendersons were invited for Sunday dinner. My mother spent 2 days cleaning and cooking. The house smelled of roast chicken and beeswax. I was instructed to wear my blue dress, the modest one, and to be on my best behavior. The entire meal was an ordeal. I sat there, pushing my mashed potatoes around my plate, while my father and Mr. Henderson talked about profit margins and inventory. Walter would occasionally ask me a bland question, like if I enjoyed sewing, and I would give a one-word answer. I could feel Arthur's absence like a physical ache. I imagined him in his father's workshop, the smell of sawdust and turpentine in the air, creating something beautiful with his hands, while I was trapped in this stuffy dining room, being appraised like livestock. Later that evening, after they had left, my father cornered me in the parlor. "Walter Henderson is a fine young man," he stated, not asking for my opinion. "His family is well respected. He could provide a good life for you, a secure life." "I don't love him, Papa," I whispered, staring at the floral pattern on the carpet. "Love," he scoffed, the word sounding like an obscenity on his tongue. "I've given you a good life. Your mother and I, we didn't have the luxury of love when we were your age. We had the luxury of survival. You will learn to respect him. That is what matters." The conversation was over. It wasn't a discussion. It was a decree. The next day, I met Arthur by the creek. I was crying before I even reached him. He held me, letting me soak the shoulder of his worn shirt. I told him everything. About Walter, about the dinner, about the cold finality in my father's voice. "Then we'll leave," he said, his voice fierce. "We'll go now. We'll go to the city. I'll get a job, any job. You won't have to marry him, Lily. I won't let you." His words were a balm, but they were also terrifying. To leave, to run away. In those days, a girl didn't just up and leave her family. It was a scandal, a disgrace. I would be disowned, a pariah, and what would we live on? His dreams and my hope. But then I looked at his face, so full of earnest love for me, and I compared it to Walter Henderson's placid, uncurious stare. I knew I couldn't do it. I couldn't sentence myself to a life of quiet desperation. "All right," I said, my voice trembling but resolute. "We'll go." We made a plan, a fragile, hopeful plan. We'd save what little money we could over the next month. He would ask about work from a cousin he had in the city. I felt a flicker of wild, terrifying freedom. That night, my parents were arguing. I crept out of my room and sat at the top of the stairs, my heart pounding. Their voices were muffled, but I could hear the anger in my father's tone, and the pleading in my mother's. "She is stubborn, just like you," my father's voice boomed. "She has a good heart, William," my mother replied, her voice strained. "Don't break her spirit. I will not see her throw her life away on some penniless dreamer." He roared back. "She will marry Walter Henderson by the end of the summer. I have made up my mind, and that is the end of it." I shrank back into the shadows, the words hitting me like stones. The end of the summer. That was my deadline. My future had been decided. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that I would have to fight for it, or lose myself forever. The weight of my father's declaration settled over the house like a shroud. The end of summer. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. A life sentence. Every tick of the grandfather clock in the hall sounded like a countdown to my own undoing. My mother would look at me with sad, knowing eyes, but she said nothing more. She knew, as I did, that my father's mind was a fortress with the gates rusted shut. My only solace was my older brother, Thomas. Thomas was for years my senior and as practical as my father, but he had a kindness in him that my father kept buried. He was apprenticing to be an accountant. He understood numbers and logic, not poetry and art. He didn't understand my love for Arthur, but he understood my unhappiness. One afternoon, he found me in the garden, listlessly weeding the petunias. He sat on the bench beside me. "He's wrong, you know," he said quietly, not looking at me. "Father, he thinks he's protecting you, but he's just afraid." "Afraid of what?" I asked bitterly. "That I might be happy. Afraid of you struggling like he did," Thomas said. "He forgets that sometimes the struggle is the whole point." He reached into his pocket and pushed a small, folded bundle of cash into my hand. It wasn't much, maybe $20, but to me, it was a fortune. "I don't know what you're planning, Lily," he said, finally meeting my eyes. "But if you need a little help, well, there it is. Just be smart." His simple act of faith was like a match struck in the dark. It made me feel less alone, less crazy. It's a strange thing, isn't it, how in your darkest moments, you can feel like the only person in the entire world who has ever felt that way. It's a lonely, isolating feeling. By the way, dear, where are you watching from? What time is it there? I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Sometimes just knowing someone else is out there, listening, makes all the difference. The feeling of connection, however small, gave me strength. But fate, oh dear, fate has a cruel sense of timing. The very next day, it happened. The day my world shattered into a million tiny pieces. My father had come home early from the shop. I didn't hear him come in. I was in my room, with the door closed. I had the music box out. I wasn't playing it, just holding it, tracing the painted flowers on the lid with my finger. It was my connection to Arthur, my tangible piece of hope. I was lost in a daydream, imagining a life in the city, a life of freedom, when my door was flung open with such force that it slammed against the wall. My father stood there, his face a mask of purple fury. His eyes weren't on me, they were locked on the music box in my hands. I'll never know how he found out. Maybe he'd been suspicious all along. Maybe someone in town had seen me with Arthur and said something. It didn't matter. He knew. "What is that?" he demanded, his voice dangerously low. I tried to hide it behind my back, a foolish, childish instinct. "It's nothing, Papa." He strode into the room in 2 steps and snatched it from my grasp. He turned it over in his large, rough hands. It looked so delicate, so fragile there. He found the wind-up key. He turned it, his movements jerky and violent. He lifted the lid, and the first few notes of Claire de Lune tinkled out into the tense silence. The sound, which had always been my comfort, now sounded like a funeral dirge. "That dreamer," he spat, his voice trembling with rage. "He gave you this. You've been sneaking around behind my back, defying me in my own home." "Papa, please," I begged, tears streaming down my face. "It's just a gift. It's a promise," he roared, his control finally snapping. "A promise of a life of filth and poverty. I will not have it." And then he did it. With a guttural cry of rage, he raised the music box high and threw it down onto the hardwood floor. The sound was sickening, a sharp, shattering crack that echoed the breaking of my own heart. The beautiful porcelain box, my precious secret, my symbol of hope, exploded into dozens of pieces. The little ballerina snapped off her stand, her delicate arm breaking away. The music mechanism gave one last, choked, discordant groan and fell silent. I stared at the wreckage, at the glittering dust of porcelain on the floor, and I felt something inside me break right along with it. I looked up at my father. His chest was heaving, his face still red with anger, but I saw something else in his eyes then, a flicker of shock, maybe even regret, as if his own actions had startled him. But he didn't take it back. He couldn't. He pointed a shaking finger at the door. "You will forget that boy," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "You will, prepare to marry Walter Henderson." or you are no longer my daughter." He turned and walked out, leaving me alone with the ruins of my future scattered at my feet. Chapter 4. Gathering the pieces. For a long time, I just stood there. The silence in the room was louder than my father's shouting had been. It was a dead, hollow silence, filled with the ghosts of the notes the music box would never play again. I looked down at the floor, at the carnage of porcelain and brass. The little ballerina lay on her side, her painted smile still intact, a cruel mockery of the joy she once represented. A sob tore its way from my chest, a raw, ragged sound. I sank to my knees, my dress pooling round me. I didn't cry for the broken object. I cried for the broken promise, for the brutality of it, for the love my father saw as a disease to be eradicated. In that moment, he hadn't just broken a music box, he had tried to break my spirit. My first instinct was to just leave the pieces there, a testament to his rage, to let my mother find them and see what he had done. But then, a different feeling began to smolder beneath the grief, a quiet, defiant anger. He would not be the one to sweep away my dreams. Not then, not ever. Slowly, carefully, I began to pick up the pieces. My fingers trembled, and a sharp edge of porcelain sliced my thumb, a tiny bead of blood welling up. I barely noticed. I gathered every last shard, from the largest chunks of the box to the tiniest, glittering slivers. I collected the broken ballerina, her severed arm, the silent musical movement. I wrapped them all tenderly in one of my handkerchiefs, as if I were swaddling a wounded creature. I hid the little bundle in the very back of my sock drawer, a new secret born from the ashes of the old one. The house felt different after that. The air was thick with unspoken words. My father avoided me, his silence a heavy cloak of disapproval. My mother would look at me, her eyes filled with a helpless sorrow. She knew. She didn't have to ask. She would leave my favorite meals outside my door, small, silent peace offerings I couldn't bring myself to eat. I spent the next 2 days in a daze of despair. I felt trapped, a bird in a cage whose door had been slammed shut and locked. I would look at my reflection in the mirror and see a pale, haunted stranger. This was the girl who would marry Walter Henderson. This was the girl who would live a sensible life. This was the girl whose heart would be a barren, empty room for the rest of her days. But on the third night, something shifted. I was staring at that stranger in the mirror, at her tear-stained cheeks and vacant eyes, and a spark ignited. It was the memory of Arthur's face, his belief in me. It was the memory of my brother's quiet support, and it was the image of my father's face, not his anger, but the flicker of shock that had crossed it. He was a man ruled by fear, and I decided, right then and there, that I would not be. I made a decision. It was the most terrifying, monumental decision of my life. I would not stay. I would not marry Walter. I would not become a ghost in my own life. My father had given me an ultimatum. Forget the boy or you are no longer my daughter. He thought he was trapping me, but what he had really done was give me a key. He had given me a choice. And I chose me. My despair transformed into a quiet, focused energy. The plan Arthur and I had made, the one that seemed like a fantasy, was now my only option. I wrote him a short, urgent letter, telling him what had happened, and that I was ready. Meet me at the station, Thursday, the first morning train. I gave the letter to a friend I trusted to pass it to him. Then, I began to prepare. I had a small, worn satchel. At Do You Pack When You Are Leaving Your Entire World Behind? I took my warmest cardigan, 2 changes of clothes, the small amount of money my brother had given me, and the few dollars I had saved myself. I took the small cloth bundle of broken porcelain from my drawer. I couldn't leave it behind. It was mine. The night before I was to leave, my mother came into my room. She didn't turn on the light. She just sat on the edge of my bed in the moonlight. She didn't say, "Don't go." She didn't say, "Your father is right." She just took my hand. Her hand felt so frail in mine. "The world is bigger and sometimes harder than you think, Lily," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "But you are stronger than you think, too. You have my heart. Never forget that." She pressed a small, folded wad of bills into my palm. It felt substantial. A good portion of her housekeeping money, I was sure. "Be safe," she whispered. And then, she was gone. Her silent blessing was the final piece of armor I needed. It was an act of quiet rebellion, of a mother's love defying a husband's decree. I knew she would face his wrath for it, and the thought pained me. But I also knew she had given me the only thing she could, a chance. and I was going to take it. For a long time, I just stood there. The silence in the room was louder than my father's shouting had been. It was a dead, hollow silence, filled with the ghosts of the notes the music box would never play again. I looked down at the floor, at the carnage of porcelain and brass. The little ballerina lay on her side, her painted smile still intact, a cruel mockery of the joy she once represented. A sob tore its way from my chest, a raw, ragged sound. I sank to my knees, my dress pooling around me. I didn't cry for the broken object. I cried for the broken promise. For the brutality of it, for the love my father saw as a disease to be eradicated. In that moment, he hadn't just broken a music box, he had tried to break my spirit. My first instinct was to just leave the pieces there, a testament to his rage, to let my mother find them and see what he had done. But then, a different feeling began to smolder beneath the grief, a quiet, defiant anger. He would not be the one to sweep away my dreams. Not then, not ever. Slowly, carefully, I began to pick up the pieces. My fingers trembled, and a sharp edge of porcelain sliced my thumb, a tiny bead of blood welling up. I barely noticed. I gathered every last shard, from the largest chunks of the box to the tiniest, glittering slivers. I collected the broken ballerina, her severed arm, the silent musical movement. I wrapped them all tenderly in one of my handkerchiefs, as if I were swaddling a wounded creature. I hid the little bundle in the very back of my sock drawer, a new secret born from the ashes of the old one. The house felt different after that. The air was thick with unspoken words. My father avoided me, his silence a heavy cloak of disapproval. My mother would look at me, her eyes filled with a helpless sorrow. She knew, she didn't have to ask. She would leave my favorite meals outside my door, small, silent peace offerings I couldn't bring myself to eat. I spent the next 2 days in a daze of despair. I felt trapped, a bird in a cage whose door had been slammed shut and locked. I would look at my reflection in the mirror and see a pale, haunted stranger. This was the girl who would marry Walter Henderson. This was the girl who would live a sensible life. This was the girl whose heart would be a barren, empty room for the rest of her days. But on the third night, something shifted. I was staring at that stranger in the mirror, at her tear-stained cheeks and vacant eyes, and a spark ignited. It was the memory of Arthur's face, his belief in me. It was the memory of my brother's quiet support, and it was the image of my father's face, not his anger, but the flicker of shock that had crossed it. He was a man ruled by fear, and I decided, right then and there, that I would not be. I made a decision. It was the most terrifying, monumental decision of my life. I would not stay. I would not marry Walter. I would not become a ghost in my own life. My father had given me an ultimatum. Forget the boy, or you are no longer my daughter. He thought he was trapping me, but what he had really done was give me a key. He had given me a choice, and I chose me. My despair transformed into a quiet, focused energy. The plan Arthur and I had made, the one that seemed like a fantasy, was now my only option. I wrote him a short, urgent letter, telling him what had happened, and that I was ready. Meet me at the station Thursday, the first morning train. I gave the letter to a friend I trusted to pass it to him. Then, I began to prepare. I had a small, worn satchel. What do you pack when you are leaving your entire world behind? I took my warmest cardigan, 2 changes of clothes, the small amount of money my brother had given me, and the few dollars I had saved myself. I took the small cloth-wrapped bundle of broken porcelain from my drawer. I couldn't leave it behind. It was mine. The night before I was to leave, my mother came into my room. She didn't turn on the light. She just sat on the edge of my bed in the moonlight. She didn't say, "Don't go." She didn't say, "Your father is right." She just took my hand. Her hand felt so frail in mine. "The world is bigger, and sometimes harder than you think. Lily," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "But you are stronger than you think, too. You have my heart. Never forget that." She pressed a small, folded wad of bills into my palm. It felt substantial. A good portion of her housekeeping money, I was sure. "Be safe," she whispered, and then she was gone. Her silent blessing was the final piece of armor I needed. It was an act of quiet rebellion, of a mother's love defying a husband's decree. I knew she would face his wrath for it, and the thought pained me. But I also knew she had given me the only thing she could, a chance. And I was going to take it. Chapter 5. The first morning train. The world was still blue and gray when I left. That hazy time just before the dawn. I didn't dare turn on a light. I moved through the sleeping house like a phantom, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the old house settling, sounded like a gunshot in the silence. I paused at the bottom of the stairs, my hand on the newel post, and looked back into the shadows of the home I had known my entire life. It wasn't just a house I was leaving. It was my childhood, my mother's quiet love, my brother's solidarity, the ghost of the girl I used to be. A single tear traced a cold path down my cheek, but I wiped it away. There was no time for goodbyes. The air outside was cold and crisp, smelling of wet leaves and the promise of autumn. The moon was a sliver of bone in the sky, offering just enough light to see my way. I walked quickly, my small satchel bumping against my leg. The town was asleep. The windows of the houses were dark, unseeing eyes. It felt like I was the only person awake in the entire world. With every step I took, away from my home, a strange and potent mixture of terror and exhilaration grew inside me. I was running away. I was free. I saw him before he saw me. He was standing on the station platform, under the weak glow of a single gas lamp, stamping his feet to keep warm. Arthur. His shoulders were hunched against the cold, and he kept looking down the tracks, his face etched with worry. When he finally saw me hurrying towards him, the relief that washed over his features was so profound it nearly brought me to my knees. He ran to me, and we met in a clumsy, desperate embrace. He held me so tight I could barely breathe. "You came," he whispered into my hair. "Lily, I was so afraid you wouldn't come." "You got my letter," I said, my voice muffled against his coat. "I did. Are you all right? Your father, ... "I'm all right," I said, pulling back to look at him. "Let's just go, before someone sees us." The train arrived with a great sigh of steam and a screech of brakes, a metal beast come to carry us away. We found a seat in a nearly empty carriage. As the train lurched forward, pulling away from the station, I looked out the window. I watched my little town, the only world I had ever known, shrink and then disappear behind a stand of trees. I had done it. I was gone. The journey was long. We didn't talk much at first. The reality of what we had done was settling in. We were two children, really, with a handful of dollars between us, running towards a future that was a complete unknown. Arthur held my hand, his thumbs stroking my knuckles, but there was a new tension between us. This wasn't a secret meeting by the crib anymore. This was real life. We arrived in the city late in the afternoon. It was an assault on the senses. The noise was a constant roar of traffic, of crowds, of industry. The buildings were so tall they seemed to scrape the gray sky. It smelled of coal, smoke, and exhaust, and 100 different kinds of food all at once. It was dirty and chaotic and terrifying and magnificent. We were two small fish who had just been dropped into the middle of the ocean. Arthur had the address of his cousin, but it was in a part of the city that looked nothing like the grand avenues we first saw. The streets grew narrower, the buildings more crowded and grimy. We found a room to rent in a boarding house. It was tiny, with a single, sagging bed, a stained wash basin, and a window that looked out onto a brick wall. The whole place smelled of boiled cabbage and damp. But it was ours. It was our first home. The first week was the hardest. The city was indifferent to our hopes and dreams. Arthur looked for work every day, coming back to our little room each evening more discouraged than the last. The money was disappearing at an alarming rate. We lived on stale bread and cheap soup. The exhilaration of our escape began to fade, replaced by the cold, gnawing anxiety of survival. The vibrant colors of our shared dream were starting to wash out into grim shades of gray. One evening, after another fruitless day, the strain finally broke us. "Maybe we made a mistake," Arthur said, his voice flat. He wasn't looking at me, but at the peeling paint on the wall. "Maybe your father was right." His words hit me harder than any of my father's shouts. "Don't say that," I whispered. "Never say that." "Why not? Look at us, Lily," he said, his voice rising with frustration. "We're starving. We have nothing. I can't even get a job sweeping floors. What kind of life is this? I took you away from your home for this." The fear and the stress of the past week boiled over inside me. I chose to come. I shot back. "This is hard, yes, but it's better than that life. It's better than being sold like a prized pig." The argument devolved from there, our words becoming weapons born of fear. It ended with him storming out of the room, slamming the door behind him, leaving me alone with the smell of cabbage and the sudden, terrifying thought that I had not only lost my home, but I might be losing him, too. The silence that Arthur left behind in that tiny, grim room was heavier than any I had ever known. I sat on the lumpy bed, listening to the unfamiliar city sounds outside my window, a distant siren, the rumble of a passing truck. The argument had stripped away the last vestiges of our fairy tale escape. We weren't star-crossed lovers from a poem anymore. We were two scared, hungry children in a world that didn't care about us. The thought that I had made a terrible mistake, that my father had been right all along, began to creep in. But as I sat there, something else happened. I thought about the broken pieces of the music box, wrapped in my handkerchief in my satchel. I had carried them with me. I had chosen to save them. And in that moment, I had a realization that was both heartbreaking and liberating. I hadn't just run away to Arthur. I had run away from myself. My love for him had been the catalyst, the spark that lit the fuse, but the will to escape, the courage to build a different life that had to come from me. He couldn't give it to me. When Arthur came back an hour later, his anger was gone, replaced by a quiet shame. "I'm sorry, Lily," he said, sitting on the far side of the bed. "I'm just scared." "I know," I said, my voice soft. "I am too, but we can't turn on each other. It's us against the world right now." That night marked a change. The passionate, desperate romance of our secret meetings by the creek was gone. In its place, something new began to grow, something quieter and more resilient, a partnership. We were a team. The next morning, I went out by myself. I walked until my feet ached, past the factories and the warehouses, looking in every window for a help wanted sign. I was turned away from a dozen places. I was too young, too inexperienced. Finally, I found a small diner, the windows steamy and the air thick with the smell of grease and coffee. The owner, a gruff man with a stained apron and tired eyes, needed someone to wash dishes and clear tables. The pay was next to nothing, but it was a job. It was a start. When I came back to the room that evening, my hands raw and my whole body aching, and showed Arthur the few coins I had earned, I saw a new kind of respect in his eyes. My small victory spurred him on. A few days later, he found work hauling crates at a market. It was backbreaking labor, not the artistic life he dreamed of, but it was work. We were surviving, slowly, painstakingly. We started to build a life. It wasn't the beautiful life we had imagined. It was a life of exhaustion, of counting every penny, of sharing a small bowl of stew for dinner. But it was our life. We learned to find joy in small things, a shared smile at the end of a long day, a walk in a small city park on a Sunday, the simple comfort of knowing we were not alone. About 6 months after we'd left, a letter arrived, forwarded by my trusted friend. It was from my brother Thomas. My hands trembled as I opened it. He wrote that things at home were quiet, too quiet. My mother was sick with worry, though she never spoke my name in my father's presence. And my father, Thomas, wrote that he had changed. He didn't shout anymore. He just worked, coming home late and sitting in his chair in the parlor, staring at nothing. He had aged 10 years and half a one. Reading those words, I felt not triumph, but a deep, hollow ache. I had won my freedom, but the cost was a chasm of silence and pain that stretched all the way back to that little town. I began to see my father not as a tyrant, but as a tragic figure, a man so terrified of the past that he had destroyed his own family's future. Our life in the city continued. We moved to a slightly better room. I was promoted from washing dishes to waiting tables. Arthur, in his spare moments, started to sketch again, capturing the gritty, vibrant life of the city around us. But our paths, which had run so perfectly parallel for a time, were slowly beginning to diverge. He was offered a chance for an apprenticeship with a sign painter, a man who had seen his talent. It was a real opportunity, a step towards his dream. But the job was in another city, 100 miles away. We talked about it for a long time. We could try to make it work long distance. I could try to find work there and follow him. But we both knew, deep down, that it was an ending. Our shared journey of survival was over. Now, it was time for our individual journeys to begin. Our parting wasn't angry or bitter. It was filled with a deep, sorrowful tenderness. We had saved each other, in a way. He had given me the courage to leave, and I had given him the anchor he needed to survive. Now, it was time to let go. "You'll be a famous artist one day, Arthur," I told him at the train station, the place that had become a symbol of both our beginnings and our endings. "And you'll be happy, Lily." he said, his eyes sad but sincere. You deserve that more than anyone I know. And then he was gone, on another train, leaving me standing on another platform. But this time, I wasn't a scared girl running from something. I was a woman, standing on her own 2 feet. I had a job. I had a little money in my pocket. I had a room to go home to that I paid for myself. And in my satchel, I still had the broken pieces of a music box, waiting to be put back together. I was alone, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't lonely. Life, doesn't stop for heartbreak. It keeps moving, and you have a choice. You can either move with it, or get left behind. I chose to move. Being on my own in that big city was daunting, but I had learned to be resilient. I had learned to rely on myself. The girl who was afraid of her own father's footsteps in the hall was gone for good. I kept working at the diner. I made friends with the other waitresses, women with their own stories of hardship and survival. They taught me how to be tough, how to be savvy, and how to laugh even when I was tired down to my bones. I eventually got a better job as a clerk in a department store. And then, because I was good with numbers, a trait I suppose I did inherit from my father, I was moved into the accounting office. I took night classes. I was building a life, brick by brick, one that was sturdy and safe and entirely my own. And in the quiet evenings in my small apartment, I started a new project. I would take out the handkerchief filled with the broken pieces of my past. I bought a special kind of glue, and with the patience of a saint, I began to piece the music box back together. It was a slow, painstaking process. Some of the pieces were so small they were like dust. My hands, which were now used to hard work, learned to be gentle again. Each piece I fitted back into place felt like I was healing a small part of myself. I knew it would never be perfect. The cracks would always be there. But I wasn't trying to erase the damage. I was trying to honor the survival. Several years passed. I met a wonderful man, a kind and steady man who loved me for the strong woman I had become, not the demure girl he was supposed to want. We married. We had children. I told him my story, all of it. He listened, and he understood. We built a good life, a life filled with love and laughter. The kind of secure and happy life my father had wanted for me, but one that I had found on my own terms. Then, one day, another letter from my brother, Thomas, arrived. Our father was very ill. The doctors said it wouldn't be long. My husband, bless his soul, looked at me and said, "We should go." I hadn't been back in almost 15 years. I was afraid, but I knew I had to. Not for my father, not really, but for me. For closure, I packed a small bag for the trip. On a whim, I wrapped the mended music box in a soft towel and placed it inside. It still didn't play, but it was whole again, in its own way. My hometown looked smaller, the way places from your childhood always do. My family home looked tired. My mother hugged me at the door, her hair now completely white, and we both cried without saying a word. My father was in his bed in the parlor. He was so shrunken, so frail. The powerful, intimidating man who had dominated my youth was gone, replaced by a fragile old man, lost in a sea of blankets. He couldn't speak much, but his eyes, they were still sharp. He looked at me, and I saw no anger. I saw recognition. He saw the woman I had become, and I looked at him, and I finally understood what my brother had tried to tell me years ago. I saw the fear that had driven him his whole life. I learned later from my mother that his own family had lost everything in the Depression, that he had watched his own dreamer of a father fail and fall into despair. His tyranny hadn't come from a lack of love for me, but from a terrifying abundance of it, twisted by his own trauma. He wasn't trying to break my spirit. He was trying to save me from the ghosts of his own past. I sat with him for hours. One afternoon, I unwrapped the music box and placed it on his bedside table, his eyes fixed on it. He saw the web of golden cracks where I had glued it together. He slowly raised a shaking hand and traced one of the cracks with his fingertip. A single tear escaped from the corner of his eye and rolled down the papery, wrinkled landscape of his cheek. No words were exchanged. None were needed. In that silent moment, a lifetime of anger and misunderstanding dissolved. It wasn't forgiveness, in the sense of saying, "It's okay." It was forgiveness, in the sense of saying, "I understand." And with understanding comes peace. He passed away a few days later. I stayed for a while, helping my mother, reconnecting with my brother. We talked for hours, filling in the lost years, forging a new relationship as adults. And now, here I am, an old woman, in a cozy kitchen, with the rain tapping on the window and a good cup of tea in my hands. The music box sits on my mantelpiece. It's the most beautiful thing I own, not in spite of its cracks, but because of them. They are a map of my journey. They prove that something can be broken and still be beautiful, that something can be put back together and be even stronger in the broken places. The lesson, my dear, is not that love conquers all, because sometimes it doesn't. And it's not that you should always run from your problems. The lesson is that courage isn't about not being afraid. Oh dear, I was terrified. Courage is about being afraid and doing the right thing anyway. It's about making a choice to save yourself, and forgiveness. Forgiveness isn't for the other person, it's for you. It's about putting down a heavy bag you've been carrying for far too long. The world will try to break you, that's for certain. But you get to decide if you stay in pieces, or if you painstakingly, lovingly, glue yourself back together, and let the cracks show where the light gets in.